Chris O'Connor here. Join our prestigious Curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock. Also be on the lookout for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. Toward the end of the 1980s, and right at the dawn of the 1990s, glam metal / hair metal had reached its apotheosis on the American rock scene. Both rock radio and MTV were saturated with the likes of Motley Crue, Poison, Warrant, Winger, Whitesnake, Skid Row, and frankly, even Guns N' Roses, who were just a dirtier, angrier version of the form. Yes, both yours truly curmudgeons are old enough to remember the days of 1980s rock radio, when the only respite from the glam metal onslaught were brief interjections of U2, REM, and occasionally The Cure. It's a big reason why, starting in 1987, young listeners like us, especially me, gravitated toward the classic rock sound from the 1960s and 70s. Forget the hairspray and spandex. Bring us The Who, Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Pink Floyd, Jimi Hendrix, the Doors, etc. Yeah, that felt like real authentic rock and roll to us, even to some kids in their early teens in the late 1980s. People, especially younger generation rock music fans, have to understand that wide swaths, even millions of teenagers during the end of the 1980s had no clue about the indie alternative underground that was bubbling underneath the surface. We had no idea about the existence of bands such as Sonic Youth, the Pixies, or the Replacements. This was way before the internet. Commercial radio and MTV were pretty much our only outlets back then. That's why it was such a breath of fresh air when, right between the apex of glam metal and the imminent mainstream explosion of that indie alternative movement, when the Black Crowes emerged in 1990. They were the one mainstream rock band that stood for the classic rock values of the 1960s and 70s without slavishly copying their influences. They had the swagger, the look, the chops, the riffs, the sound that was unlike anyone else at the time, and they had a riveting frontman and lead singer in Chris Robinson, who owned one of the most authentically soulful voices rock had seen in quite a long time. Their debut album, Shake Your Moneymaker, was a multi-platinum success, elevating them to the big time. And after Nirvana ushered in the grunge / alternative era, and thereby ushering in the fourth golden age of rock, the Black Crowes stood their ground with 1992's The Southern Harmony and Musical Companion, a southern rock masterpiece that seemed bigger than life, unabashedly flaunting rock's deep-rooted connection to black R&B and soul music while racking up more hit singles. They seemed destined for all-time great status. When the middle of the decade rolled around, the Black Crowes wisely aligned themselves with the burgeoning neo-hippie jam band movement characterized by bands such as Phish, the Dave Matthews Band, and Blues Traveler. Yet, their popularity started to wane and their rock radio presence dissipated. They went from being the natural successors to the Rolling Stones to being a smallish cult band with a hardcore following that, while never again reaching the heights they reached in the early 1990s, still managed to pull in people at 2,000 to 3,000 capacity venues. But they should have been bigger. They had iconic status in their hands and let it slip away. What happened to them is a classic case of a great rock band that did themselves in due to interband and especially fraternal conflict, drug abuse, jealousy, egos, and simply and tragically refusing to follow their musical strengths. Welcome to the Curmudgeon Rock Report as we give you an examination of the Black Crowes.
Quote, if I was interested in perfection, I would have been an architect. Rock and roll is not perfect. The way everyone plays is the way they are. So says Chris Robinson to a reporter from the San Diego Union Tribune last summer in a newspaper article in August. That sounds about right when we're talking about the Black Crowes, doesn't it, Arturo?
Yeah, it does. And here's another aspect of the Black Crowes. Black Crowes drummer Steve Gorman, who now is not with them anymore, but he does a podcast, and he published his memoir a couple of years ago called Hard to Handle. It's about his time with the Black Crowes, and there's a great story in there. He and Chris Robinson, the lead singer of the band, were having a bit of a debate / discussion about being more in touch with Black Crowes fans and what Black Crowes fans want and expect of the band. And basically, Chris Robinson accused Gorman of not knowing or not being in touch with what Black Crowes fans want. And Gorman went back at him like, Chris, are you kidding me? Dude, you spend more money on marijuana in 1 year than than most of our fans make in their salary during the year, right? And Chris Robinson says, no, I don't. And Gorman says, okay, Chris, how much on pot do you spend every year? Robinson says, oh, about $100,000.
Definitely not perfect. Yeah, I'll tell you. You know what else is hard to handle, by the way, don't you?
What?
The trip over into the parallel universe.
Oh, good segue.
That's hard to handle, but alas, here we are over in the parallel universe. We have crossed over through that rip in the space-time continuum, and over here we like to say that blue is green and tall is short and so on, and that rock and roll is still the predominant music that dominates the world. It's predominant because it dominates, man. I'm telling you, it's large, it's massive, it's on the billboards, it's in the arenas, it's in the stadiums. Taylor Swift, got to give her respect. You know, she's not as bad as I once thought, but at the same time, over here, she would not be playing Giant Stadium. It would be some of the bands that we discuss during this segment. Parallel Universe is where we look at new and newish albums by artists we think are cool and artists that we think that you should be attuned to. And so we're going to start this, Arturo, talking about a very, very interesting Mexican band that has one of the better albums either of us has heard this year. Correct, Arturo?
Yeah. Hailing from Mexico City, alternative rock band Lorelle meets the Obsolete just recently released their 6th album, Datura, Datura. Now, they've been around for about a decade, and they started out as a shoegazer band. But what separated them from the usual mill of shoegaze bands was the usual mill of shoegaze bands with their wussy woo-woo vocals and ethereal guitars in the clouds nothingness. What these guys had, well, guy and girl, is the level of grit and backbone that their music had. In their previous album, 2019's De Facto, they started to strip away the shoegazer elements of their sound. For this new record, you just cannot call Lorelle Meets the Obsolete a shoegazer band anymore. What you now have is this spooky, intense, aggressive art rock with hints of industrial and grunge, made all the more bracing by unpredictable rhythmic shifts. They never lose their knack for engaging melodies and guitar hooks, though, that really counteract, or better yet, complement the abrasive, almost post-punk mood of the music. It's a pretty short record that packs quite a bit of punch in 8 songs. Recommended tracks are the opening title track Dynamo, and, well, the entire second half of the album. It's a terrific outing from a band that has thoroughly reinvented itself. As of now, it is my number 3 album of the year. Chris?
Yeah, it's pretty high up there for me too. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the second half of the record. I agree with that. Very, very strong. It's an 8-song record, and the last 4 songs are all tremendous. And they kind of hit this unique rhythmic spot. And essentially, what I can use to describe this album is take Nirvana's Endless Nameless, i.e., the hidden track from Nevermind, and just replace the guitars with electronics. Yeah. And it's got that kind of intensity and that kind of beat. Clearly, David Grohl is an influence on their percussion and drumming, and Cobain, and obviously Kevin Shields, and guitarists like that are big influences. I'd like to say Martin Gore in terms of his songwriting. Yeah. I think there's some Depeche Mode in there for sure.
There is some. Yeah, like I said, the shoegazer is gone. They kind of stripped it away, man.
Yeah, the shoegazer, down with the Jesus and Mary chain and up with Nirvana, I guess. Yeah. And so now it's been a little bit of a mild upset here, Arturo. It took until mid-June of 2023 to get our very first King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard album of the year. This coming on the heels of 5 real albums, 1 remix album, and 1 little EP last year. It all in 2022. When last we encountered King Gizzard, they were releasing 3 albums within a month of each other, about 6 weeks, and so they're 2 of them are inessential. Laminated Denim and Changes they're either boring or sloppy or both.
Leftovers, what they are. They're basically the leftovers from their jam sessions.
Yeah, one of them might as well just be Made in Timeland Part 2, literally, but is way less boring, or is way more boring than Made in Timeland. And so, but the one that was great,
one of the best albums of the year.
Yeah, the one that was great was my number 3, I think, if I remember correctly, on my year-end list.
My number 3 as well.
Yeah, and I think it was number 3. It was either 3 or 2, something like that. But anyway, it had one of my favorite album titles of all time: Ice, Death, Planets, Lungs, Mushrooms, and Lava. Now, what do you think they sang about on that record? Yeah, and so that's the last time that we heard from them. They were releasing those 3 records, and that incredible jam record. Well, now here, I'm excited for a couple reasons for this new record, which I'm going to say the full title of this record now, just because it deserves its own little section here. Drum roll, please. Petrodragonic Apocalypse, or Dawn of Eternal Night, and Annihilation of Planet Earth, and the Beginning of Merciless Damnation. Now that's my kind of album title. Yeah. So, if you're going to run a popular jam band or jamish band called King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, and you're going to be as prolific as this band is, it's also pretty much mandated that they once in a while need to make a record about either gizzards, lizards, or wizards. Well, the band comes through this time out with an album largely about, a giant witchcraft-born demon lizard. And in terms of the sound, I mean, this band goes all over the place. They're one of the more impressive bands in the world in terms of, I think in terms of just talent. This is one of the more talented bands in the world, because they can just kind of wake up one day and say, hey, we're going to go down to the studio and we're going to do some jams. Oh, and by the way, let's do another speed metal record, even though, so they can go from giving reverence to Santana and Frank Zappa and other adventurers of the late 60s to now giving reverence to Metallica, Motorhead, and Mastodon, and not necessarily in that order.
Right.
And so this is a spiritual cousin, if not a sequel, to 2019's masterpiece, Infest the Rat's Nest.
To this day, I still think it's their very best album.
Yes, it's one of their 2 or 3 best records, for sure. And this may actually, you could make the argument that this is, well, it's certainly one of the two best since then. But in terms of the quality of the music, this is really, really, really strong. Again, so yes, they are dabbling again in speed metal. And once again, it is aggressive as hell. Stu McKenzie makes a frighteningly, he does a convincing impression of James Hetfield. I'm not exactly sure how, but it does work. And so the first two songs, you get a reasonably coherent fantasy narrative where man's love of gasoline-powered fast cars brings forth the wrath of God in the form of a badass apocalyptic tornado. Hence the second song, Supercell, which rocks balls and is probably the best piece of music on the record. And then this lyric from track 4 called Witchcraft basically gives us the whole gloriously dumb rest of the story. Quote, I am Beowulf, I am Cat Black, knock the candle from the scripture stack. I bring justice at moment right. Gila monster, set alight. Unleash a reptile, thinking in terms of only lizard brain, and be not lucky enough to make any mistakes again. Like a grenade in a fist, the air ignites a bloody mist. Moon cycle shifting, demon lifting, Beowulf grifting ritualist. Alas, the cat disrupts the prayer and turns it on meekest there. The tiny creature, a harmless skink, transforms into a mythic king. Witchcraft.
You could tell these guys were cracking up while they were writing these lyrics.
Yeah, I mean, this is just...
They had to be.
Yeah, this is just... Yeah, it's completely absurd. And so, yes, it starts off in the first two songs, you think they're going into the sort of the profound existential crisis territory, climate change inspired, that they were doing in Infest the Rat's Nest. C, the song Planet B. They were very sort of profound and almost... what's the word I'm looking for? Almost wistful on that record in terms of the theme. Well, here it starts out that way, and then it just turns into a big dumb Godzilla movie. And not only a basically a lizard rising from the pollution that is Godzilla, but they take it a step further, and it is born by witches, man. That is just fan-fucking-tastic.
Ecological witches, environmentally friendly witches.
Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose, or maybe like a firehouse if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon, help us expand our little community, and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock.
Now, Arturo, what exactly did the Black Crowes mean for rock and roll when they first hit the scene in roughly 1990? Let the Crowes, the brothers Robinson, Chris and Rich, talk a little bit about this themselves, quoting from an article that David Frick wrote about them in a May 1991 Rolling Stone article. So Rich starts this. He says, quote, I think we served the same purpose the Stones did 20 years ago or Aerosmith did 15 years ago. Quote, just to slap you in the face and say, shut the fuck up and listen. And then Chris chimes in, quote, how many new rock stars have come around that have anything to say at all, rails Chris. Guys where you even want to know what they were thinking. Are they thinking? Where did it go astray? And leaves it at that, end quote.
Yeah, Chris Robinson never lacked for confidence, did he?
No, he did not. And so that is the kind of swagger that these guys brought to rock and roll. The only band that was even close to what the kind of what they were offering to at that time was probably Guns N' Roses. And so, but even with the GNR at the height of its powers, the Crows were still a breath of fresh air when they hit, especially coming at the time that they did, i.e. off of the 80s, correct?
Right, exactly. The core of the Black Crowes has always been, as you mentioned, Chris, the Robinson brothers. Older brother Chris on vocals, younger brother Rich on guitar. They grew up in Marietta, Georgia, a suburb of Atlanta in Cobb County. As teenagers in 1984, they formed a band called Mr. Crow's Garden, named after the Leonard Leslie Brooks children's book, Johnny Crow's Garden. Oddly enough, when they started out, they were a very REM-influenced jangle pop band with roots in 1960s psychedelic pop. They later stretched out into heavier 1970s style blues rock. They did a demo for A&M Records in 1987, and the label offered them a quote-unquote demo deal, basically a low-cost commitment that amounted to a let's see what you got before we give you a real deal. By this time, Steve Gorman joined the band on drums. The REM connection didn't end there. Jefferson Holt, REM's manager at the time, had his own label called Doggone and offered Mr. Crow's Garden a straight-up conventional record deal. The band, of course, declined. By 1988, they had become a five-piece band with Johnny Colt on bass and Jeff Cease on lead guitar, and they toured up and down the East Coast. They met producer George Draculius in 1989, who convinced them to sign with Rick Rubin's Deaf American Records that year, the label home of Danzig, Slayer, and the American home of the Jesus and Mary chain. By this time, they had permanently changed their name to the Black Crowes. Draculius produced their first album, Shake Your Moneymaker, which came out in early 1990. They were getting a great word-of-mouth reputation as a terrific live band, but the album didn't really take off until the fall of 1990, when their cover of Otis Redding's Hard to Handle became a massive radio hit, going as far as the top 30 in the Billboard pop chart. They followed that up with the gorgeous classic ballad, She Talks to Angels, which also hit the Billboard top 30. The album would go on to sell more than 5 million copies in the US alone, making the Black Crowes huge stars. Now, was the album as good as its sales indicate? This is a personal one for me because this was absolutely one of the formative albums of my teenage years. Rock music was one of my salvations in my youth, but I was very disaffected by modern rock radio at the time. I just couldn't identify with the spandex, makeup, and hairspray bullshit of glam metal, nor their cheesy, sexist songs. Until Nirvana blew up and blew everyone's mind in the fall of 1991, I, and you, Chris, like millions of music lovers of our age at the time, we had no idea about the existence of an underground alternative music scene. What I got from commercial rock radio was all I got. I didn't even have cable TV in my home, so there was no MTV for me either. I still listen to modern rock radio, but mainly it was in the hope of catching any airings of U2 or REM, the only modern rock bands at the time that I liked, and it was in the greater hope that something good would emerge. Otherwise, I just gorged on classic rock of the 1960s and 70s. So when the Black Crowes came on, it felt like salvation. Finally, a band not tethered to glam metal cliche, a genuine, authentic, soulful, no bullshit rock and roll band that wouldn't sound out of place in my personal pantheon of classic rock favorites. As for the Black Crowes themselves, especially on this debut album, you can hear the influences. You can hear the Rolling Stones. You can hear a bit of 1970s Aerosmith, i.e. back when Aerosmith were good. You can hear a bit of early Rod Stewart when he was in the Faces. You can especially hear the vocal influence of Steve Marriott during his Humble Pie period. But what made the Black Crowes special is that they didn't just copy and reproduce their influences. They had their own style. They had their own stamp on this classic sound that was as distinctive as the bands that influenced them. They presented classic rock values to a younger generation with Gen X attitude, stomping riffs, and startlingly great songwriting. They, along with U2 and REM, instantly became my pre-16-year-old modern rock trio of favorites. Chris?
Yeah, that was back like 1990. It was still a truage that kick-ass rock and roll bands will never go out of style.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where the Crows came in. And it made no sense at the time because I remember you didn't have MTV. That's basically, that was my oxygen. I watched way too much MTV during that era. And so the fact that Hard to Handle went into heavy rotation in the fall of, basically, I think it was the fall of
90.
Fall of 90.
Yeah.
And then early 91, the same thing happened to She Talks to Angels. That went into even greater rotation on MTV.
It was that and Losing My Religion, just nonstop.
Yeah, and to both hit at the same time, and this is in the middle of, remember, Poison is still big at this time. Like the Belle Biv DeVoe, Teddy Riley stuff is starting to blow up at that point, and sort of pop rap is starting to come up. Remember, MC Hammer and Vanilla Ice were the two biggest artists of 1990. And so for the Black Crowes of all bands to land themselves on MTV, that's a pretty impressive accomplishment. And again, it's just a testament to, at least back then, kick-ass rock and roll and meaningful rock and roll mean something. Now, obviously, a year later, Nirvana took that and went like times 20 with it in terms of the sensation they became. And so, yeah, I agree with them. And it is funny that they tried to be a more of a modern rock band before somebody figured out that, Chris Robinson's really damn good when he does Humble Pie covers in concert or Faces covers in concert. So why don't we just go in that direction? Because that style fits Chris Robinson like a glove. And so what you had is Chris Robinson as a vocalist who had true soul and a true depth, but also was mining in the same territory as the Rod Stewarts, as the Steve Marriotts, maybe even a little bit of Van Morrison, although that might be a stretch.
Otis Redding. Yeah,
Otis Redding. Yeah, I mean, I think Otis Redding is obviously a big influence on Robinson, but then you have Rich Robinson, who as a songwriter and as a rhythm guitarist had a very distinct style. So you have a very original, very talented natural songwriter, and also Robinson is a very talented lyricist, and so you have a classic, well-worn vocal style, and you mix it with a very unique blend of musical influences and just talents, and you come up with just an extraordinarily original. It was weird. It was like they're a throwback, but they're like the most startlingly original throwback imaginable.
Right. Yeah. Like I said, you can hear their influences, but they're not regurgitating their influences.
No, not at all.
And presented it in a fresh new package.
Yeah, it is not Rod Stewart karaoke.
Yeah,
that is one thing that you can say for sure. And so, are we officially talking about Shake Your Moneymaker here?
We are talking about Shake Your. We're not in Southern Harmony yet. That's coming up very soon, though.
Okay, so to talk about Shake Your Moneymaker a little bit, awesome album. I've always been a huge fan of Twice as Hard. That is one of the best album openers, certainly of the era, and one of the best of all time. Just really, really killer. They sound like they're having so much fun making that record. There's an energy.
It was their first album. It's their first album. Yeah.
I mean, there's just an energy. There's a pervasive aliveness to that record. Yeah. And it's not a restrained record at all. Like, Seeing Things for the First Time is kind of like, it's almost like their take on Joe Cocker's version of With a Little Help from My Friends.
Yeah.
But it's done with so much panache and so much flavor that you just have to love it. And then, like we said, She Talks to Angels, which I'm never sure exactly what that song is supposed to be about. It's I'm in love with a weird girl. I think the first line makes you think it's another heroin dirge, but nope, it's just I'm in love with a weird girl. And so there's just so much energy to that. Obviously, the cover of Hard to Handle
Right.
is just wonderful, and I actually prefer it to the original. And a lot of that has to do with Gorman's drumming on that.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah, he kills it. Yeah.
yeah, there's just again, just energy. There's a thrilling nature to it, and you know, it's not Southern Harmony, which we'll talk about shortly. But it's on its own. It's just a really just awesome, awesomely powerful rock and roll record that just like song after song, like Jealous Again is another killer on that. And, you know, that's more sort of almond-y. Oh, speaking of the almonds, it's worth mentioning that the organist and keyboardist in the band for that first record is Chuck Leavell.
Yeah.
Yes. Chuck Leavell, as in Dwayne Allman's replacement in the Allman Brothers.
Right.
Who was the pianist. You know, everybody knows Jessica. He's the pianist.
Wait. Chuck Leavell did not replace Dwayne. Dwayne was a guitar player.
I know. Well, okay. Now you're being all technical. No, what it is they made the decision not to go with the 2 lead guitar thing.
Right. Okay.
And so Leavell came in, and so what it is he had his own flavor with his piano, like awesome piano solo on Jessica, and those types of things. So there you go, motherfucker. I did not get that wrong. But anyway, you know you got something special when you get Chuck Leavell to be your organist and keyboardist for your debut record. Nobody's ever heard of you, but Chuck Leavell, you got his endorsement. Good stuff.
Yeah. Well, there was absolutely nothing wrong with the next album the Black Crowes did, The Southern Harmony and Musical Companion. Now, we talked about this album at length in the 1992 episode of our 4th Golden Age of Rock series.
We did.
Basically, the Black Crowes released their follow-up to Shake Your Moneymaker in the spring of 1992, The Southern Harmony and Musical Companion. And on this album, they took their bombastic take on 1970s blues rock and augmented it with Southern soul, R&B, and gospel in order to produce a snarling, majestically powerful piece of epic Southern rock. It was their only album to ever hit #1 on the Billboard Albums chart. While it didn't have any top 30 pop chart hits, there were some all-time classic songs, Remedy, Thorn in My Pride, and Sting Me, that all hit #1 on Billboard's modern rock chart. There were some lineup changes as well. Mark Ford replaced Jeff Cease on lead guitar, and the band added a full-time keyboard player in Eddie Harsh. This would become known as the vintage classic Black Crowes lineup for the next several years. If you really want to hear us wax rhapsodically about this record, please go listen to our 1992 episode of our 4th Golden Age of Rock series. Needless to say, it's an album that has to be heard to be believed. It's on my list of 500 greatest albums ever, and for my money, one of the 3 best Southern rock albums ever made. Chris?
Yeah, I would say it's on the tail end of my all-time greatest records too. It's a personal favorite of mine. You know, like junior year of high school, the second half of junior year of high school was all about this record. And Remedy is up there in the big leagues with Freebird as a song that is an event every time I hear it. You know, if I'm driving around and I'm listening to the local rock station and that comes on, it's an event every single time. It's just that good a song. It's got that much flavor to it. And the thing about this record is this does have some restraint. This does have some refinement, and that there's a depth to the recording and the arrangements to it that you didn't quite get on Shake Your Moneymaker. Like a song like Thorn in My Pride, which just has this vibe, almost a poignancy to the vibe with the like you said, the gospel piano and the backing vocalists at the end. This sort of almost like going to church piece at the end of that. I mean, that's just beautiful. And there's the cover of Time Will Tell by Marley, which is a neat touch to end the record with. And then, you know, you just get some classic songs, other classic songs, you know, Hotel Illness and My Morning Song, which I've always loved. And Sometimes Salvation is a lot of fun. So it's just a really strong record. Mark Ford is a tremendous lead guitar player. So that was a step up from the first record. So, Ford over the next three records, like his lead work. And that's the thing that people need to know, that, Rich Robinson is the famous one, but he's the rhythm guitarist.
Yeah.
And occasionally he's kind of like the Keith Richards. He was an occasional lead player up until halfway through. And then, he kind of just started to step up. But at this point, he's the riffs guy, and obviously awesome riffs guy. But the lead work on this record is mostly from Mark Ford, and it's a really special work on that. So not too many bad things to say about this record at all. There are no bad things to say about this record, and I can see where you're coming from when you call it one of the three best Southern rock records, because it's their spin. It's a very unique. It's what the Black Crowes are known for, and so we'll talk about this a little bit later in the episode. But when you get to the albums that they did after they reunited, or they sort of refocused, they're about 15 years ago now. You say, oh, they sound like the Black Crowes. Why? Because of the template that they created on this record, Southern Harmony and Musical Companion. And so that's a pretty special thing to say.
On this episode, we gave a thorough examination of the career of the Black Crowes. For the next episode, we're going to give you the first installment of our next mammoth series. We've done the first golden age of rock, a two-parter that covered the 1950s rock and roll explosion. We've done the fourth golden age of rock, an epic nine-parter that reviewed rock's last period of relevant brilliance that spanned most of the 1990s. That leaves us with a gap of two more golden ages, eh? Well, in 2 weeks, we are putting out the first of a 9-part series, spread apart intermittently with other episodes in between, called The Second Golden Age of Rock. This is the period from the mid-1960s to the very early 1970s, when everything, and I mean everything, changed for the world on a cultural level. We're obviously focusing on the music, but those changes in music at the time echoed, or perhaps even foreshadowed, the sweeping cultural changes that the world saw in film, art, fashion, politics, and even technology. Our maiden voyage will bring us to 1964, where the explosion of Beatlemania portended the arrival of British rock music as an international pop cultural force, the rise of Bob Dylan and socially conscious music, the mainstreaming of the sweet R&B sounds of Motown into the American consciousness, and, thanks to the Beach Boys, the solidification of surf rock as an American musical institution. Oh yeah, and we'll also talk about those 4 scruffy kids from Liverpool, England. Join us next time for The Second Golden Age of Rock, Part 1, 1964. So, when the Black Crowes' third album, Amorica, came out in 1994, it came with some controversy. The album cover was a picture taken from a 1976 issue of Penthouse magazine, that of a woman's crotch wearing a thong designed after the U.S. flag.
Complete with bush on the sides.
I know. It wasn't the most tasteful or progressively minded idea for an album cover, and it cost the band, as many commercial retailers refused to carry the record. They had to change it and release another version with the album cover where like it's all black and you just see the thong, right? Anyway, it went only as high as number 11 on the Billboard album chart. As for the music itself, I've always had an up, down, up relationship with it. At the time of its release, I loved it. I thought it was an expansion of Southern Harmony's gospel soul rock that saw the band experiment with Latin music and funk. Then I fell out of love with the record because I thought the songwriting dragged in some spots. Now I think it's terrific again. And some of those songs that I thought sucked were actually acquired taste tracks for me. Chris?
Yeah, same here. This is a very, very underrated record. So they kind of go from sounding effortless on Southern Harmony to hear they are pumping up some effort. There is an effort to sort of segue and experiment, and so you do get some experiments with Latin rhythms, and you do get some cheeky, almost British or early Britpop little rhythms like you get on stuff like P25 London.
Yeah.
And or like a Conspiracy, which is very sort of wah-wah driven. And so you do get some of that, but to me, most of it works. Me personally, I love Wiser Time. I mean, it's just a tremendous song. It's just a great piece of songwriting. It has the soul from those first two records, but it also has a sunnier sheen to it. And so and not only that, but just really, really pretty harmony and some really terrific pedal steel work from Rich Robinson in the back on that. And then also, obviously, Gorman, who I guess you can say he wasn't the technically greatest drummer, but boy, could he hit the shit out of the kit.
Yeah.
He had that mud stomp level drumming. And so you get that. And then I'm also a big fan of the album closer, Descending.
Beautiful
which
song.
is just really, really pretty. And it's, it's a good, not necessarily breakup song, but it's just kind of like, oh baby, we're far enough into this relationship where the magic that I bring is gone.
Yeah.
Hey girl, I'm descending again, and I'm losing my allure. But it's just really gorgeous. These piano intro and outro, slide guitar, like acoustic slide guitar, which is just really pretty. It's one of their prettier songs, and it's so plaintive and so simple that it's almost it's almost what would you say? Almost like soaring. It's like
sure.
Yeah, it soars in its plaintiveness, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, well, it's a beautiful love. It's a ballad. It's a breakup ballad. It's one of the very best songs in their entire repertoire.
Absolutely. So again, underrated record. Not as good as the first two. It's a little bit. It's chancier. It is a little bit inconsistent. The middle of the record. Like, I mentioned P25 London, but that and Ballad and Urgency kind of represents a little dip, a little lull in this album. But overall, it's still somewhere between 3.5 and 4 stars, maybe closer to 4.25. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Well, anyway, in the aftermath of Amorica, knowing that they were commercially slipping, they made a decision that seemed wise at the time. They aligned themselves with the neo-hippie jam band movement in rock that was taking off in popularity at the time, thanks to bands like Phish, the Dave Matthews Band, and Blues Traveler.
Yeah, they got themselves on the Horde tour.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention. This whole scene was epitomized at the time by the Traveling Horde, HORDE, Horizons of Rock Developing Everywhere Festival, which was basically a Lollapalooza for jam bands. The Black Crowes signed up for the 1995 summer tour as the headline act. While it was successful, it backfired on them in the long run because it exposed them as a band that wasn't really good at being an improvisational jam band. Don't get me wrong, they were great musicians, but it takes something else to be able to capture and keep the audience's attention with improvisational music.
Yeah.
Virtuosos like Phish, for example, were seemingly able to invent new forms of music whenever they jammed. The Black Crowes, on the other hand, while adept at their instruments, were pretty uninspired and plain whenever they ventured into improvisational territory. Their strength was this powerful, bombastic, blues, soul, R&B, funk hybrid blaring in the background while Chris Robinson sang his guts out and pranced around the stage with all the charisma of a young Mick Jagger. By the time of Amorica, Robinson had become enamored of the Grateful Dead and seemed intent on reinventing the Black Crowes in that style and image, with Robinson just being a static, stoic performer on stage, no longer a performer in capital letters. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I could see where that would come in. And remember, this is around the time that there's strain there. Robinson, by his own admission, is probably doing too many drugs. at this point. And, him and Rich Robinson, they had a relationship that was up and down because Rich Robinson was a teetotaler and he was, he was a pretty serious guy. And so they were just, sibling rivalry is going to end there. So they seem to have lost a little bit of direction because like you said, by 95, they're a made band. And so one way or another, they're always going to have a built-in fan base. And so, okay, now that we're made, where do we go from here? And so I think that there was some tension there, and we'll talk about this right now. Essentially, is they go from sounding effortless to putting in some effort and still coming up with a great record, but you can tell that they're making an effort to try new things, to now straining for something new or straining for relevance is not the right word, but straining for let's continue this. We need to be something else. What is that something else? And they strain, and as a result, become remarkably inconsistent.
Yeah, well, I mean, interesting you say strained. I'll get to that. First of all, Three Snakes and One Charm came out in the summer of 1996, and it continued the Black Crowes' slightly commercial decline, peaking at number 15 on the Billboard album chart. That's great for most bands, but with the heights the Black Crowes had scaled, it had to come as a bit of a disappointment. Now, the commercial decline paralleled, like you referenced, Chris, another increasing problem for the band, and it was the relationship between the Robinson brothers, which really started to erode during the making of Amorica and continued into the making of Three Snakes. Throw in drug problems by most of the members of the band, not just Chris Robinson, but Mark Ford as well, all except Rich, like who you said was a teetotaler. And the band was becoming a toxic mess. Unlike Amorica, the making of Amorica was strained and labored. The making of Three Snakes and One Charm was not a labored, overproduced effort, but it sounded like it.
Oh, yeah.
Which is really weird. They rented a house for all the band members to live in order to build some camaraderie. The result was an album that, in my opinion, has actually aged quite well because of its adventurousness. I kind of like it. There's a distinct Sly and the Family Stone feel to the record, with the R&B soul elements of the Southern Harmony album coming to the forefront while being bolstered by never before heard horn arrangements. I like Blackberry. It was a single. It's indelible pop rock of the first order. In our curmudgeonly parallel universe, this would have replaced Dave Matthews in all those adult contemporary radio stations.
Yeah, no shit.
Good Friday is a gorgeous blues-tinged secular gospel ballad of mournful regret and is another should have been, could have been hit song. If you listen closely beyond the guitar-heavy crunch of Nebuchadnezzar, I kind of like that song. You will hear the closest the Black Crowes ever came to the Beatles in regard to melody and song structure. Now, Chris, you and I actually saw the Black Crowes when we were seniors at Syracuse University in the fall of 1996. We saw them at the Landmark Theater in either September or October. Remember that?
October of 1996. Yep, I do remember that. And very, very good show. And the only thing about that era of the band, and they've talked about it in interviews, at that point, Mark Ford had gotten himself so strung out on heroin, most nights they had to unplug him. Yeah. Because, Rich Robinson has said, there'd be nights where they're supposed to be playing Remedy and he's playing something completely different. So literally they had to unplug him. And so what I remember most about that show, like you said, alluded to, that I just remember that the energy was great. Robinson was a really magnetic front man and, kind of bouncing around doing his thing. But the jams themselves, it just kind of it was uneven. It was dull.
They weren't good at jamming. That's not their strength.
Yeah, it was messy. It was a messy show. And so, when you talk about Three Snakes, so you hit the nail on the head that it's an album that it's one of the only albums they demoed the record. In other words, they really worked on it, and they had the record was pretty much pre-made so that they could kind of, have a laid back feel. And I guess the recording was a lot of fun and people enjoyed it because it was demoed, but you wouldn't know it because the record is so tense. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's not a relaxed set of songs. It's not confident. And it's loud and it's tense and it's a little uptight. And the highlights, many of which you mentioned. I'm also a big fan of Bring On, which is very White Album era Beatles.
Yeah.
And Blackberry's cheesy, but I can see it's a decent single. But Black Friday is the best song on the record, and that song is really held up, and obviously it's still a staple of their shows even now. But the stuff, there's some cosmic slop on it too. And the horns, the horns are a little bit horrific when they show up. The one sort of new touch that does work is the auto harp in a couple of places. The auto harp or the blues harp shows up in a couple of songs, obviously most prominently on Good Friday. So strange record. I said the good stuff, you're right, has aged well. The bad stuff has not aged well and has only gotten worse over time. And it makes me, it's a lost opportunity record where it's, maybe they came up with something sonically interesting, but the songs they were just, it was a muddy period for them.
Yeah, it really was, drugs, arguments, decline in popularity, poor Black Crowes. But anyway, this classic period of the Black Crowes ended when guitarist Mark Ford was fired and bassist Johnny Colt quit. Reinforcements joined the remaining core trio, the Robinson brothers and drummer Steve Gorman, and just in time, as Columbia Records bought out Deaf American and absorbed the Black Crowes into the company's fold. The band went into the studio with producer Kevin Shirley to make a set of lean, mean, stripped down, straightforward, bare-boned rock and roll songs that harken back to their classic debut album. And that they did. By Your Side was released in early 1999, and songs like Kicking My Heart Around and Go Faster roar out of the speakers like blues rock hurricanes. The Black Crowes were masters at finding the nexus point where pop, soul, and gospel met, and the title track is a perfect example of that. It's a perfectly produced, skillfully written, expertly executed, timeless classic rock record. The one problem, it didn't sell. It peaked at only number 26 on the Billboard Albums chart. The tour for the album was very successful, though. They sold out theaters and 2,000 to 3,000 capacity venues all over North America, and even went on a summer amphitheater tour, co-headlining with Lenny Kravitz. The Black Crowes maintained their core audience, but even they were resigned to the Crowes being a legacy act at this point. Another thing to keep in mind, and this comes from Steve Gorman's memoir, the Black Crowes during this period did two things to piss off the honchos at Columbia. Number one of the top guys wanted the Black Crowes to do a cover of the Rolling Stones' It's Only Rock and Roll. And they wanted to push that as a single. The Black Crowes just adamantly refused because they didn't want to be pigeonholed as a Rolling Stones wannabe band. So that pissed off the heads of Columbia. And number two, remember that Bruce Willis movie that Aerosmith did the song for? What was it?
Armageddon.
Armageddon, right. They wanted the Black Crowes to do a Diane Warren song. The Black Crowes said, no, we're not doing a fucking Diane Warren song. So those are two strikes against them, and the company just kind of took their support away from them after that.
Yeah, I don't know. Them doing a cover of It's Only Rock and Roll, that sounds pretty good in my head.
Yeah, but I can see why they wouldn't want to do that. They don't want to be pigeonholed as a Stones wannabe.
No doubt.
They've always been compared to the Rolling Stones. Like, oh, come on, that's just predictable at that point.
Yeah, it was, and you're right. I mean, the album didn't sell because they didn't promote it. I remember that was right as I was starting to work for SonicNet when that album was being pushed or not pushed. I just remember that there was very, very little effort that was made. And in a way for the band that was good because, the true blue fans, the faithful stayed with them. And it kind of was the beginning of the formation of the cult that has sustained them in the 20 years plus. Right. They've got a reputation for being one of the best live bands in America. Despite their lack of jams, they're so good and so soulful and such a good tight band, and there's a chemistry. Even if the Robinsons want to kill each other half the time, there's an undeniable chemistry that those guys have.
Right.
So you do get this. As far as the record itself, I like it more. I think it's a very good record, and because at that point it was like, fuck it, let's just go back to doing what we do, and let's just make a flat out rock record. Let's not reinvent the wheel here. And so it very much is in the spirit of Shake Your Moneymaker. Now, I did see a quote that when after they left Columbia and signed a V2, when they were promoting Lions, which we'll get to in a bit, Rich Robinson said that the label really wanted us to just make another Shake Your Moneymaker. They just wanted us to just kind of go back and just do that again, which, as it turns out, is pretty much what they did with By Your Side. So it almost makes it sound like they didn't necessarily want to do that, but it worked out because, again, it's a very, very strong record. And what I like about it is it's a consistent record too. I mean, the shortest song is 3 minutes and 36 seconds. The longest song is like 4 minutes and 46 seconds. Yeah. And so everything is just, it's the same, length, structure, tightness. Robinson's the only guitarist on it, so he plays all the guitar parts. So it's a very economical record. It's in and out. It's boogie. It's woogie. It's rock. It's roll.
Yeah,
and it's just really strong. I mean, kicking my heart around, and title track is really good too. That's a strong song.
Yeah, fantastic.
By Your Side. Record. Yeah, absolutely. So then, they come off of this.
Whoa. The comeback. I'm going to talk about the comeback.
Oh, there is the comeback.
There is a comeback. In October 1999, the Black Crowes got together with Jimmy Page.
Yes, they
to
did.
Do a series of shows in Los Angeles, New York, and Worcester, Massachusetts. They did mostly Led Zeppelin songs with some blues covers and a few Black Crowes songs thrown in for good measure. The shows all sold out and were extremely successful. And more importantly, they were critically successful. Music media was back on the Black Crowes bandwagon, praising them for the terrific live band that they had always been. This led to a double live album put out on TVT Records in early 2000, with all the material taken from Page and the Crowes' two-night stand at the 6,000 capacity Greek Theater, the big, beautiful outdoor venue in Los Angeles. It sold all right, not great, but critics loved how the Black Crowes as a band put a unique, soulful, southern fried spin on all those classic Led Zeppelin songs. Page and the Black Crowes reunited for a very successful and lucrative summer amphitheater tour in 2000, with several dates supporting The Who. That must have been a hell of a show.
Oh, yeah.
It seemed the only person who wasn't happy with the proceedings was Chris Robinson himself. In an interview at the time of the live album's release, he said, quote, "I didn't really have that much fun doing it. It was all right, and Jimmy's a phenomenal guitarist, but to me, it was just a job. I'm not a big fan of Robert Plant's lyrics or his singing, so that part of it was a little boring for me." End quote. Well, that's too bad. Chris.
Well, which is weird because he's not doing a Robert Plant impression. He's singing those songs as Chris Robinson.
Yeah, which is why it works.
Yeah, and like the version of Custard Pie is fan-fucking-tastic off Live at the Greek because Robinson's doing Robinson. And so, and Jimmy Page is obviously he's on that record, and I don't know, whoever recorded it and mixed it did a fabulous job. It's a really strong live record, and I encourage everybody listening to go seek it out on YouTube. You have to go to YouTube. It's not on Spotify for whatever reason, but that's okay. I mean, you can find most everything you need anyway on YouTube, and probably should.
Yeah.
Just because. But yeah, anyway. They did have that little bit of a comeback, and they were at least relevant for a short time, and then they shot themselves in the foot.
Right. The Black Crowes joined Virgin Records, and their first album for the label, following the success of the Jimmy Page collaboration, was Lions, released in the spring of 2001. It was both a commercial disappointment, only number 20 on the Billboard album chart, and a critical failure. And for once, the naysayers were right. It's a shit record through and through. They were totally trying to capitalize on the Page collaboration by going for a Zeppelinized sound, which is ironic considering how Chris Robinson went on record saying he wasn't a fan of the whole Zeppelin thing. More than that, the band sounds like they're mailing it in with some of Chris Robinson's most uninspired lyrics. It's a moribund bore and my candidate for worst Black Crowes album ever. Chris?
Yeah, which is really strange because in terms of sound, it might be their most well-produced record. They worked with Don Was. Don Was actually produced this album. But the thing is okay, that's fine. It sounds great. But when you're when you're hinting at Steven Tyler of Aerosmith, as opposed to, Mick Jagger or Robert Plant or anything like that, it's almost like Toys in the Attic is part of the inspiration for where he's at. They didn't like being pegged as a classic rock wannabe band. Well, this album is a really strange way to make an argument against that because it's right on point as them being a classic rock aping band, and otherwise known as extremely boring. And so at this point, even like Three Snakes and One Charm might be like frustratingly uneven, but it sure as shit ain't boring. This record,
the best thing you can say about Lions, it's still better than Greta Van Fleet.
Yeah. Well, okay. Nowhere to go but up, baby. Nowhere to go but up. I do like Lickin'. I think Lickin' is a good single. That's a pretty good song, but the rest of it, is a shit bomb. And I personally, part of it is that was, I think, year one or year two of Chris Robinson's marriage to Kate Hudson. So I think he was in love with his Hollywood starlet. So when you're inspired by your like child of privilege muse, maybe the angst and the soul and the balls, they kind of take a vacation.
Yeah, the daughter of Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell probably wasn't a good muse for Chris Robinson.
True
anyway, drummer Steve Gorman quit the band in 2002, and that caused the band to go on hiatus. It lasted for about 3 years when guitarist Mark Ford, clean and sober, and keyboardist Eddie Harsh rejoined the Robinson brothers, and they toured throughout 2005, even opening for Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers on a summer tour. That must have been a fun show.
Yeah, seriously.
Harsh and Ford left the band again in 2006, and from 06 to 07, the band was basically a revolving lineup behind the Robinson brothers. They toured a lot throughout those 2 years, especially making treks to Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. In 2008, the Black Crowes released their 7th album, War Paint, on independent label Megaforce. Guitarist Luther Dickinson from the North Mississippi All-Stars had been a member of the Crowes touring band the previous couple of years and was now in the fold as a full-time member. More importantly, Steve Gorman was back behind the drum kit. War Paint was definitely an improvement on Lions, and fans rewarded it when the album debuted at number 5 on the Billboard chart, the Black Crowes' highest placing since the Southern Harmony and Musical Companion back in 1992. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the record. It's definitely better than its predecessor, and you start to hear the band branch out into country and folk music, something the Crowes only hinted at in previous albums. I just don't think the songwriting is up to par yet. It will get much better later on, though. Chris?
Yeah, this album, you're right. It is uneven, and it does hint at some special things to come, but it has its own special moments. I think that you've got the song "Oh Josephine," which, by the way, has 1,125,429 plays on Spotify. So it actually does. It does have a little bit of a following on there.
Huh.
And Evergreen following it. And I think both of those songs kind of show that Luther Dickinson was by far the best guitarist that was ever associated with the Black Crowes or ever will be. That guy is a remarkably good lead guitar player in a blues and folk and or folk construct. And so it's not without its hits or whatever, but what it does is it kind of shows them regaining their footing. which they had
Right.
lost. They had lost after 1998. You know, they had struggled for a few years, but still had some footing. After 1998, they lost their footing and lost their way. This is their coming back around. And, but like you said, this is the warm-up act to what came next. Well, they said, well, you know, since we had so much fun making this record, you know, let's try, you know, we like experimenting. You know, Levon Helm has this little barn up in Woodstock, New York. What if we were to like do the Let It Be thing, and like let's rehearse a whole bunch of new songs and play them for a small audience of people? Wouldn't that be a good thing?
Well, here's what happened.
Yes.
Here's what happened. Another move to another indie label, this time Silver Arrow Records, brought about a new album, 2009's Before the Frost, ellipses Until the Freeze. Like War Paint, it peaked at number 5 on the Billboard album chart. And this is one of the genuinely underrated and most brilliant gems in the Black Crowes' entire discography. Like you alluded to, Chris, recorded live in front of a small audience in Levon Helm's studio in Woodstock, New York. For those who don't know, Levon Helm was the drummer and vocalist for the legendary band, The Band. And this album sharpens the country and folk leanings from the previous album with much, much improved songwriting. The album also sees the Crowes dip their toes in disco with I Ain't Hidin', gorgeous country balladry with Appaloosa, and The Last Place That Love Lives, gloriously grungy blues with Kept My Soul, and Sly Stone-esque boogie with Make Glad. On CD, it was a single album, but if you downloaded it online, like I did, it would have been a double album, with the second disc being loaded with beautiful, folky Americana, some of it even drifting into bluegrass. The whole project really shows the Black Crowes flowering and growing into the grizzled classic rock band they always wanted and had the goods to be. For me, it's easily their best album since the classic Southern Harmony album, and one of their top 3 albums. Chris?
Yeah, hard to believe it basically is a live record because it's so tight and so soulful.
Live in the studio, so it counts as a studio album.
Live in the studio. But the fact that they were able to just get things so tight and so soulful like that, you know, on first try is just kind of remarkable. One thing to point out about this record, you and I in our notes have the same highlights, the same songs, but there's one additional one that I think is pretty remarkable. There's a cover of a song that Steve Stills had on a record, Stephen Stills, in 1973. It's a song called So Many Times, that Stills co-wrote with Chris Hillman, singing the original song.
Chris Hillman, by the way, is the bass player from the Byrds. Yeah,
from the Byrds. And so it's a lovely, lovely little song, a mandolin-driven song. The Black Crowes version is a million times better, which is saying something. The mandolin playing by Dickinson is marvelous. The harmony vocals are on point. And there's just it's slowed down just enough to have like a Black Crowes magic to it.
Right.
That's just sort of singularly their own. And so it's just kind of a neat touch that, you know, through this 20-year studio album journey that we've gone on, that they end up in a place that's just about as strong as where they started in terms of inspiration, in terms of tightness, in terms of just the talent and the sense of mission. That's what this record has, that they hadn't had it as strong since Southern Harmony Musical Companion, is mission and purpose and focus. And this album has it in spades. It's a beautiful, beautiful record. Like you said, double record. It's about 80 minutes long or something like that, but it's actually an hour 40 minutes. So it's a long ass record, but it's worth the investment. I was saying to Arturo before we recorded that I've probably only listened to this album 4 times, and all 4 times I've heard it, I've said, you know, I really should spend more times with it. And by that, what I mean is I've had 4 streaks where I've been exploring it, but it's something that you would think would be more in my regular rotation.
Yeah. Well, now's your chance to do it.
Yes, absolutely. And everyone else's. So I get to play our audience. I am our customer persona for this here episode. Long live the Black Crowes, right?
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's wrap up the story of this remarkable band. In 2010, the Black Crowes embarked on a massive North American tour that they promoted as their farewell tour, called, quote, Say Goodnight to the Bad Guys. It featured one 90-minute acoustic set and one 90-minute electric set. It really wasn't their farewell tour, though. In summer of 2011, they played throughout Europe and even brought Jimmy Page back for a show in Amsterdam. In 2013, they did both a UK and US tour. Chris and Rich were at it again, though, disputing the ownership of the band. And in 2015, Rich Robinson announced the Black Crowes' final breakup. This detente lasted only 4 years. The brothers announced in 2019 that they had resolved their differences and planned a summer tour in 2020 with a brand new band of Black Crowes, celebrating the 30th anniversary of Shake Your Moneymaker, where they would play the whole album in its entirety. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic put a kibosh on those plans, and they had to postpone the tour for 2021. Last year, the band put out an EP called 1972,
which is
where
fun.
The Black Crowes covered songs that they liked from that year, including Moon Age Daydream by David Bowie, Papa Was a Rolling Stone by The Temptations, The Slider by T-Rex, You Wear It Well by Rod Stewart, Rocks Off by the Rolling Stones, and Easy to Slip by Little Feat. Interesting.
Yeah, that's a really great selection of songs. And you know, and I had never really thought in my mind of association of putting Little Feat and the Black Crowes in the same in the same vein, but wow, they proved that they actually can be in the same vein as Lowell George. So that is a fun EP worth checking out, and that is on all of the streaming sites. And so and so that's kind of their latest greatest their latest volley of relevance. And they talked about in that San Diego Union Tribune article that I quoted at the top of the show in 22 that it was actually their kids that kind of led to the peace treaty, because the kids were like, why do you guys not like each other so much? And is there a good reason we don't know our cousins that well?
Yeah.
Kind of shamed them into saying, they have a point. So it is kind of stupid, so it's almost like, hey, we done growing up in our 50s. That's kind of where they're at, you know.
So Chris, the Black Crow, what would you say is their legacy?
I think their legacy is they took a strain of Southern rock and extended it and found even greater depths to it. And they did it in an era that was saturated with media and with music television. And they did it for a new generation. So in other words, they took the glory and the magic of 1970s rock, and they were able to gift it to a new generation of rock and roll fans, i.e. guys, people our age, and kind of extend that flame and keep that alive. They were basically.
Although there are some younger generation people, or you'll be surprised, who are into this kind of music as well.
Yeah, it's coming back. To me, Southern rock. I mean, the Allmans and Skinner, all that stuff will never die. I mean, I love Southern rock, and it's my stuff. I hear Southern rock in almost everything. Southern rock defines me, but their legacy is that they kept that going and they extended it, and they proved that rock and roll matters and will always matter, even in the face of forces that would suggest that it wouldn't matter. And they were able to pull that off. Again, they came out in the same year that was dominated by MC Hammer and Vanilla Ice, and New Kids on the Block, and Warrant, and they were able to be successful with an anachronism, right? And so it's Back to the Future, basically
Right.
is what this band pulled off. And so I think that's their legacy. Their other legacy is as a cult live band. And that part of the rock and roll experience is the actual experience of rock and roll.
Right.
And
Right.
I think that they are one of the more magical bands of capturing that lightning in a bottle during shows. And they're the type of band that they get it right on the first take every time. They're just that kind of band. And so that's a legacy too, is extending the cult. Not only extending the sound and the soul and the heart, but extending the cult.
Right.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
So how would you term the legacy?
Exactly how you put it. Yeah, that they kept the flame of classic rock and even Southern rock alive for their generation and for even younger generations, and as a live band, as keeping Southern rock as a live experience. When they stopped trying to be a jam band and just be a fucking great rock and roll band, well rehearsed. Forget about the improvisations.
Well, there you go. And isn't it nice to know that you have synergy among yours truly, Curmudgeons, as always. So yeah, no, this has been a fun episode. The thing about our podcast is it keeps us in inspiration, in that to go from a month full of James Brown to now segueing to the Crows after having been in REM. It's been, this is talk about purpose. The purpose of the Curmudgeon Rock Report is to keep you in the best music ever made. That's what we're here to. We celebrate the best music we ever made. We relive it and relive it and relive it and relive it, and we bring it out here for you, that iconoclastic rock geek that whose spirit will never die. And we are your champions. Folks, for stuff like this and more mirth and merriment, you can always join our Curmudgeonly community on Facebook. It's always lively up there. Arturo is he's in list mania mode these days. And
1974 is coming soon.
1974 coming soon to a Facebook near you. Join us at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock. If you have anything to say about this episode, if you think we're full of it, if you think that King Gizzard is the best band ever or the worst band ever, let us know at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com, and hey, we may just respond. And we're still on Twitter. Twitter's weird. If you have a blue check, chances are you probably wouldn't dig our show, and so we take pride not having a blue check.
Well, pretty soon we may have to go to Threads, because I think that's going to blow Twitter away.
It probably could. So we might end up having to wear some nicer threads and get away from Twitter, which has become like a toxic Nazi shithole. But we are still on there for the time being. And then once in a while we still do make Spotify playlists. We'll make one on this too. I'm still working on a James Brown one. So. Holla at you, boy. We're about to get there with that.